He was dying. Everyone in that house knew it. The doctors had made their calculations, the nurses had adjusted their schedules, and the people who loved Freddie Mercury had already begun the quiet, devastating work of preparing themselves for what was coming. But on the night of November 23rd, 1991 at 11:17 p.m., with 16 hours left in his life, Freddie Mercury was not thinking about dying. He was thinking about a betrayal. He picked up the telephone with both hands. His personal assistant, Peter Freestone, would later describe how Freddie's hands had been trembling for 3 straight days. Not from the illness, from something else. From a plain brown envelope that had arrived 11 days earlier, addressed in a handwriting Freddie recognized the instant he saw it, handwriting that belonged to a man he had trusted completely for 9 years. He dialed from memory. His solicitor, Gordon Polkinghorne, answered on the 3rd ring. "Gordon," Freddie said, "I need you here tomorrow morning. First thing, I need to change the will." There was a pause. "Freddie, it's nearly midnight." "I know what time it is," Freddie said. "Will you come?" Gordon came. And the following morning, 16 hours before Freddie Mercury died, one name was erased from his will, a name that had been there for 9 years. The person who held that name stood in the 3rd row at the funeral. They did not cry. And in the 33 years since that morning, they have never spoken publicly about what happened. Not once, not a single word. This is the story of why. Before we go any further, if you want to hear the stories they buried, the names history quietly erased, the moments that never made the headlines, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. These are the stories they hoped you would never find. To understand what happened on that final night, you need to understand who Richard Cavendish was and what he meant to Freddie Mercury for nearly a decade. Richard Cavendish was not a musician. He was not a producer. He held no place in the public record of Queen's story and no column inch in the music press of the era. He was the kind of man who existed entirely in the spaces between the famous moments, the contracts signed in lawyers' offices at midnight, the licensing negotiations that nobody ever wrote about, the financial architecture that made Freddie Mercury's life possible behind the curtain of the stage. The music world runs on people like Richard Cavendish. It just rarely acknowledges them. He had entered Freddie's world in 1982, introduced through a mutual contact at EMI Records. Freddie had just turned 36. Queen had survived the catastrophic reception of Hot Space, the accusations of betrayal from their fan base, the cold reviews, the commercial disappointment that had followed one of the greatest albums of their career. Freddie was also navigating, in private, the increasing complexity of his personal life in a country where the law offered him little protection and the tabloid press had made him a target. What he needed at that moment was not another creative collaborator. He needed someone he could trust with the machinery, someone who understood money, law, and discretion in equal measure, someone who would sit in the difficult room and not repeat what was said there. Richard Cavendish was 31 years old, lean and precise, with a background in entertainment law and private wealth management. He was discreet in a way that famous people prize above almost everything else. He did not want fame. He wanted proximity to it, and he had understood since early in his career how to make himself indispensable to people who possessed it. Within 18 months of that introduction, he had become Freddie Mercury's personal business manager. He handled licensing agreements across 3 territories, managed investment portfolios, oversaw property transactions, and attended negotiations that Freddie himself preferred not to be in the room for. He was, by every account from those who observed him in this role, exceptionally good at it. He was one of only 7 people in the world with unconditional access to Garden Lodge, the inner circle that included Mary Austin, Jim Hutton, Joe Finelli, Peter Freestone, Dave Clark, and Freddie's mother, Gerbil Sara. 7 people. The number had meaning. It was not a list assembled by accident or convenience. It was a list assembled by trust, and trust was the currency Freddie Mercury guarded more carefully than any other. Richard Cavendish had been on that list for 9 years. Those who worked alongside Richard during those years described him in almost identical terms: efficient, composed, invisible when he needed to be, present when it mattered. He attended the right meetings and disappeared from the wrong ones. He spoke carefully and listened more than he spoke. He was in the vocabulary of the people who observed him from close range, exactly what he appeared to be, and in Freddie Mercury's world, that was rarer than almost any other quality a person could possess. Freddie, by all accounts, trusted him without reservation, and this, more than anything else, is what makes what happened so extraordinary to those who later learned of it. Freddie Mercury was not a man who trusted people carelessly. The years of fame had cost him that luxury at great personal expense. He had a precision instrument inside him for detecting the moment when loyalty became performance, when affection became calculation, when a friend began to look at him and see an asset rather than a person. He had lost people he loved to that distinction before. Richard, he believed, was different. Richard, he believed, was the real thing. He had been written into the will in 1983. Not as the primary beneficiary that was always, and would always be, Mary Austin, the woman Freddie once described as the only person he truly trusted with his whole life. But the figure assigned to Richard's name was significant. It was the kind of number that communicates trust rather than obligation, affection rather than duty. It was a deliberate act, considered in private. And for 9 years, Richard Cavendish gave Freddie Mercury no reason whatsoever to question the instinct that had put it there. The envelope arrived on November 12, 1991, 12 days before Freddie's death. Peter Freestone received it with the Morning Post and carried it upstairs without opening it. He would later say it felt different from the others, not heavier in any physical sense, but weighted in a way he could not explain, as though the paper already understood what it contained. Freddie read it alone. Peter did not return for 2 hours. When he came back into the bedroom, Freddie was sitting upright against the headboard, the letter folded across his lap, staring at the window. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, all these years, and I never saw it. What was in that envelope? The answer requires understanding something that had been happening inside the financial structure of Freddie Mercury's estate for nearly 3 years. Something that Richard Cavendish had calculated Freddie would be too ill, too exhausted, or simply too trusting to ever discover. He was wrong on all 3 counts. By 1988, Freddie Mercury's health had begun to deteriorate in ways that could no longer be fully concealed from the people inside Garden Lodge. He had not made a public statement. He would not until 2 days before his death. But those who lived and worked closest to him knew, and Richard Cavendish knew, and it appears that Richard Cavendish had begun at some point in that knowledge to make certain private calculations about the future. The envelope contained 11 pages of documentation compiled by a private financial investigator engaged through a trusted intermediary. Freddie had commissioned the investigation 3 weeks earlier, 3 weeks during which some part of him had apparently already begun to suspect. The documents detailed a pattern of transactions spanning 31 months, royalty sub-licensing agreements, signed in Freddie's name and bearing his authorization on catalog material dating back to the earliest Queen recordings. These agreements diverted a percentage of future revenue to a holding company registered in the Channel Islands. The holding company had one beneficial owner. His name was Richard Cavendish. The sums involved were not catastrophic in absolute terms. That was precisely the point. They had been structured with considerable care to remain beneath a threshold that would trigger an automatic audit. Small enough to avoid detection, large enough, compounded across 31 months, to require 11 pages to document properly. It was not a crime of desperation. It was a crime of patience. Freddie read every page. He did not call Richard. He did not call his solicitor that afternoon, or the following morning, or the day after that. He waited. Those who knew Freddie well would tell you that this waiting was entirely consistent with the man he was. Freddie Mercury did not confront people impulsively. He observed. He allowed the full weight of a situation to settle inside him before he moved. And when he moved, the movement was final. He waited 10 days. And then, at 11:17 p.m. on the night of November 23rd, he picked up the telephone and made 2 calls. The first call was to Gordon Polkinghorne. The second was to Mary Austin. What he said to Mary in that second call has never been fully disclosed. She has spoken only once about the events of that final night, in a private conversation that reached a journalist in 2009 and was never published. What she said was this: Freddie was not angry. He was sad. He said he was sad that he had not seen it sooner. And then he said something I have thought about every single day since. She did not say what it was. She has never said. Gordon Polkinghorne arrived at Garden Lodge at 8:30 on the morning of November 24th, 1991. The amendment to the will took 40 minutes. Richard Cavendish's name was removed from every clause in which it appeared. In its place, Freddie attached a handwritten note, not a bequest, not a legal instruction, but a personal note fixed to the document with a single paperclip. Gordon Polkinghorne has never disclosed its contents. He has said only that it was characteristic of Freddie and that it required no legal interpretation whatsoever. Freddie Mercury died at 6:48 that evening. He was 45 years old. 4 days later, Richard Cavendish stood in the third row at West London Crematorium for 45 minutes. He did not speak to Mary Austin. He did not speak to Jim Hutton or Peter Freestone. He did not look at the people around him. When the service ended, he left before most of the other mourners. He did not look back. In the months that followed, as the probate process began, Richard Cavendish engaged a legal team and made a formal inquiry suggesting the will amendment had been executed under conditions of diminished capacity. The inquiry went no further. In 1993, the Channel Islands Holding Company was quietly dissolved. Richard Cavendish left London the following year. He has never given an interview. Not to a journalist, not to a documentarian, not a word on or off the record. Not about Freddie Mercury, not about Queen, not about the 9 years he spent inside the most private circle of one of the most famous lives of the 20th century. He is 73 years old. He lives outside of public life. He has no social media presence, no professional profile, no public trace of the decades since he left London. The plain brown envelope that arrived at Garden Lodge on November 12, 1991, is believed to be held among the documents in the Freddie Mercury Estate Archive, alongside the handwritten note in the paperclip, and the will amendment that Gordon Polkinghorne completed in 40 minutes on the last morning of Freddie Mercury's life. All of it in a box somewhere. All of it waiting. Mary Austin still lives at Garden Lodge. She was left the property, the majority of the estate, and according to those close to the probate process, that handwritten note on a paperclip, which Freddie had attached to the will amendment on the last morning of his life. She has said in interviews across 3 decades that she reads it still. She has described Freddie's final weeks not as a period of collapse, but as a period of clarification, a time in which, she says, he became more fully himself than he had been in years. A time in which he let go of things he had been carrying for a long time. Perhaps the will change was one of those things. Perhaps the act of picking up the telephone at 11:17 p.m. on November 23rd was not an act of anger or vengeance, but simply an act of honesty, the last insistence of a man who had built his entire life on the refusal to pretend. The refusal to let a lie stand in his name, even when it would have been so much easier to leave it there and let the lawyers sort it out later and never know and never say. He had 16 hours left. He used one of them to erase a name that did not deserve to remain. The envelope arrived on November 12th. He waited 10 days of sitting in that conservatory and looking at a garden going bare and saying nothing to the man whose name was on those 11 pages. 10 days of knowing and choosing the right moment. He made the call at 11:17. He was gone by 6:48 the following evening. 16 hours, one telephone call, one paperclip, one handwritten note that a woman still reads, alone, in the house he left her, and a truth that has taken 33 years to reach you. If this story stayed with you, if you believe the people history, quietly erased, deserve to be found, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We are not finished.